Hello, everyone. Happy New Year and a very warm welcome to today's webinar organized by Funds for NGOs. I am Anutma and I'll be your moderator for today's session. It's a pleasure to have you all join us. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Today's topic is starting the year strong, strategic planning and funding basics for small NGOs. This session has been designed especially for small NGOs and development practitioners who want to begin the year with clarity, focus, and realistic funding strategies. Before we begin, the webinar will run for 60 minutes, including a 45 minutes of presentation, followed by a 15 minutes of Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A option on your webinar screen. We will address as many as questions possible during the Q&A session. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available in the video section of the Funds for NGOs premium website. Webinar's objectives. By the end of this webinar, you will be able to be clearer on how to identify your NGO's strategic priorities for the year, avoiding overstretching limited capacity, to learn how to develop a simple, realistic annual plan that aligns programs, budget, funding opportunities. Understand the components of a basic annual fundraising plan, including grants, local fundraising, and crowdfunding. Identify common planning and funding mistakes small NGOs make and how to avoid them. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's webinar trainer, Cheryl Hooper. Cheryl is an experienced development consultant who has led NGOs through various stages of growth, serving as a CEO for over 20 years. She is an expert trainer who has supported NGOs by strengthening their strategic direction, fundraising, governance, staffing, and long-term sustainability. Cheryl holds a master's degree in international cooperation and humanitarian aid, along with a BA honors in sociology. She has successfully designed award-winning programs and secured funding from major donors such as US Aid, UK Aid, Comic Relief, and several grant-making trusts and foundations with a combined value of over 5 million US dollars. Cheryl, we are delighted to have you with us today. I now kindly invite you to lead the session and share screen.
Hello and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you, and a very happy new year. I hope you've all had a good break and looking forward to the year with optimism and positivity. So January is the time of year when we begin to think about planning ahead and what needs to be done across our programs and operations in our NGOs. So today, I want to help you think through the planning process to help you develop an annual strategic plan. So this will help you to clarify your priorities for the year, taking into account your current capacity. I'll help you to better understand how to develop an annual plan that aligns with your projects, your budget and funding opportunities, and we'll look at how to create a simple fundraising plan, how to position your NGO to donors, and I hope that you will learn from some of the mistakes that NGOs have made in the past and how to avoid them. So before you begin to develop your new strategy for the year, I want to just go through the things that will help you to produce a strategy that is workable and enable you to grow and develop, because it's based on reality and the stage of your NGO's development rather than something you hope to achieve. So the first thing is we will be looking at making sure that you understand the difference between your vision and mission. that you need to be clear on where you are with your programs, funding, and current resources, that you would need to develop objectives and activities that are relevant and take you forward in your mission, and then to be able to develop a realistic expenditure budget for each of your programs. And then from that, one of the key elements is to make decisions as to whether to scale up, to scale down, to pause, or continue as you are. And then from that, develop your fundraising strategy that is aligned to your programs and your capacity as it is now. So a strategy doesn't need to be complicated or long to be effective. In fact, the more simple you can make it, the easier it will be for other people in your NGO and those outside to understand it. So if you're a small NGO with few resources, it's even more important to develop a framework that is within the constraints of your organisation. So as a starting point, ask yourself, where are we now with regard to current capacity, finances, and partnerships? What change are we striving for? And then what do we need to do by way of actions to realistically achieve this? So the first thing, of course, is to be clear on your NGO's vision and to not mix this up with your mission and objectives. So think of the vision as the long-term change you want to accomplish in your community and also in the wider picture. So the vision should be inspirational and not necessarily something that you would achieve or complete. So think of it as a kind of destination that you're striving for, somewhere that you want to get to. So, for example, if you are operating in rural areas, your vision might be something about a future where all rural communities will have access to clean, affordable energy, and that the environment will be protected and returned to its natural habitat. So in other words, you're aiming for deforestation as well as part of your vision. If you're an education NGO, for example, then your vision might be something like all children will have access to education and training as a route out of poverty. So the mission of your organisation is more about who you serve, what you do, and how you do it. So your NGO's mission should guide your daily decisions. So, for example, if your NGO's mission is to provide access to education for orphaned and vulnerable children, then searching grants, when you're searching for grants, it wouldn't be appropriate to seek funding opportunities that don't reflect that mission. So in this example, a mission for an education NGO might be something like to provide access to education and training for young people up to the age of 21, to reduce inequalities and improve livelihoods as a route out of poverty. So the easiest way to understand a mission statement is to see it as the vehicle that helps you move forward towards your vision. So another example for an environmental NGO might be something like to provide alternative fuel as a solution to reduce deforestation and protect the long-term future of the environment. So all those things within that mission gives you opportunities to search for grants around the environment. It gives you an opportunity to look at education. It looks at an opportunity at supporting children under the age of 21. So those are just examples of the difference between your vision and your mission. And I'm telling you this because this is all leading towards developing your annual plan for 2026. And when we come to objectives, think of setting objectives as helping you along a pathway so that each objective is a milestone along that journey. So when developing your annual strategy, try and form objectives or milestones for the year ahead. So you should see from the examples I've given how these objectives support the mission I gave and also reflect the long-term vision of the NGO. And then when you get to deciding on activities, think of activities as the steps you take each day to achieve your set objectives. So in the case of the objective that is about training 100 farmers in alternative fuel sources, that's an overall objective that I've given as an example for a year as part of a strategy. The activities that need to happen to achieve that objective would be things like training and sensitisation meetings about the environment. There may be activities required about business development, and there may be activities around teaching farmers about alternative fuels. So all these things are concrete actions that have to take place if you are to achieve your set objectives for the year. So it's very easy to confuse activities with objectives, such as conduct 20 training sessions for farmers. But this is an activity and not an objective. If you set this as an objective, it wouldn't take you along a path of change. So it's clearer and more strategic to have an objective that is an overview of what you want to do. So, for example, improve household adoption of clean cooking practices. And then training farmers would be the activity that would help you towards that goal. So an easy mistake when searching for funding is to keep changing the mission of your NGO without really realizing that you're doing it. And lots of NGOs do it to try and fit a donor's call for proposals. So what you should really aim to do is to keep focused on your NGO's mission and adjust your activities to suit the call for proposals. So, for example, if the call is about access to education and you are an environmental charity, then depending on what the guidelines say and the criteria, you might be able to put something forward which provides access to education, but it would have an environmental focus on that. So, and then the other thing I want to say is to not be over ambitious. And so try and develop your objectives that reflect the capacity of your NGO and the funding opportunities that there are for you. So it's a classic mistake for small NGOs to go for grants that are beyond the scope of their delivery, really. So how they all fit together, if you have a look, the vision is something that you need to start with. Really be clear on that when you develop your strategic plan and your mission. Understand the difference between the two. And then from that, you will have set objectives that you agree on for the year ahead. And from those activities, think of the objectives as the pathway along to eventually leading back to your mission and vision. And then the activities are the things that you do on a regular basis to take you along that pathway and again achieve your vision and mission. So if you don't stick to the mission of your NGO, it's possible that you will try and apply for funding and respond to calls for proposals that don't fit your mission. And this will result in unsuccessful applications, over-promising results. And if the objectives are not within the scope and capacity of your organisation, you may end up expanding programs without funding and then being overstretched. So when you begin to focus on your priorities for 2026, try and focus on a maximum of 5 objectives. I would go between 3 and 5 objectives, and then align those objectives with the needs of your community, your current capacity, and what funding you think is within your reach. So if you keep to 3 to 5 objectives that are realistic, you are much more likely to be achieving them. So when you are clear on your mission, vision, objectives, and activities, you can then begin to turn the strategy into your annual work plan. So the key headings to follow should be the programs that you're taking forward into 2026 and the key activities that you will be doing, a rough budget estimate with regard to the expenditure for those programs, who is responsible for delivering different elements, and then the timeline for the activities. So when you've done this, you should be in a position to then link the annual work plan with the overall operational budget and also any proposals that you start putting forward to donors. So when you know what programs you've decided to do and the activities, you can then make sure that you research relevant calls and funding opportunities that fit your mission and vision and are within the scope and the capacity of your NGO. So remember, donors want clarity. And if you're a small and under-resourced NGO, then the way to do this is to do some scenario planning. So if you're in a situation where funding is uncertain, work out what would be the minimum funding you would need. What would be the ideal amount of funding that you would go for in an ideal world? So the full cost of a programme, and then what would be the minimum cost of the programme? And what would be a realistic budget to try and secure those grants for? So when you develop the fundraising plan to support your strategy for 2026, it's important to try and find funding that is available for the size and scope of your NGO and the stage of development that you're in, so that you don't waste time and effort applying for grants that are simply too large and beyond the scope of your ability to deliver. So aim to have a diverse funding mix that includes a range of income streams where grants should be just one element of the funding mix. So don't just spend all your time chasing grants. So with grants, if you're a small or recently formed NGO, try and seek smaller grants to begin with and look to develop regular individual giving, fundraising events, and community fundraising to strengthen the foundations of your financial foundations. So what I'm trying to say is really look beyond the scope of grants. So when you start developing your fundraising strategy, yes, put grants in there, but make sure that you are applying for the right type of grant given the stage of development that you are at and the scope of your ability to deliver. But don't ignore the other sides of fundraising. It's really important with a small NGO to start strong by building the other income streams at the same time. And of course, if you intend to have grants as part of your funding mix, then your strategy should ensure that you are grant ready. So that means that you have the basic requirements in place that funders expect. So these are things like your registration certificates and governing documents, that you have financial records and a bank account, you have clear and robust policies in place that support your programs, such as safeguarding, financial management, whistleblowing, all of those things. And after that, you must have a written case for support and clear programme descriptions that align to your budget. So what I'm saying is, in your strategy, if you don't have that, then you need to incorporate being grant ready as part of your strategy. So don't just go ahead and start thinking about, these are the programs we're going to continue with this year, this is the funding, and then you just go hell for leather to try and get the funding in place. Part of your strategy should also make sure that you are grant ready, and that will give you the strongest chance of success. So here's a simple formula to remember in a very simplistic form. So if you match the right funding opportunity and you are grant ready and have everything in place, then you can begin a realistic fundraising planning. And of course, while grants are a key income stream for NGOs, don't forget the importance of building relationships and forming strategic partnerships. So when you're a small NGO, you can really benefit from trying to work with better equipped or slightly bigger NGOs and working in partnership with them, perhaps on grant opportunities or subcontracting services and things like that. And again, that needs to be incorporated as part of your strategy for the coming year. So your annual fundraising plan, this is different to an overall fundraising strategy. What you're doing here is setting a plan and developing a plan for 2026. So this should contain the following headings, beginning with your fundraising target, which is an obvious one. So you need to be costing your programs based on your capacity. And really deciding on what is your fundraising target for the year. The funding opportunities and the sources that should be pursued. And there again, I'm not just referring to grants. So in your fundraising plan, you need to be really thinking, where else can we try and develop new income streams? And again, don't be over ambitious. As long as it's in the plan, you can take small steps towards building different income streams. And then the timeline for implementing different activities and the roles and responsibilities for implementation. And then finally, matching the fundraising activities to your annual NGO plan. So what you're trying to do here is you form your NGO plan, then you form your budget, and then from that you have a fundraising plan that dovetails into both those things. So I just want to talk through some of the common mistakes that can occur if you don't have a clear strategy in place at the start of the year. So if you write grant proposals without a strategic plan, you could follow opportunities that don't reflect your strategy for the year. And you can do something what we would call mission drift. So basically, you're just adopting a scattergun approach, going for anything that comes your way. That will weaken your case for support, and it will come across in the writing of a grant application. So another mistake is to use AI. There's nothing wrong with using AI. I did a training webinar on AI just before Christmas, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with using AI. But the big mistake is to use AI and just copy and paste onto a proposal without fact checking it and also changing it to reflect your tone of voice, your message, and making it your own. So that is something that you really need to make sure that you don't do when you are writing grants. So many small NGOs can also spend a lot of time chasing grants while ignoring local fundraising and spending time on developing other income streams. So ways to get around this is to make sure that you have a written case for support that can be used for the basis of different grant applications, using impact stories and local data to provide evidence of need, but also using that case for support for other fundraising opportunities that you want to try and develop. And another mistake is to not put the right systems and processes in place for grant management and reporting to donors. So again, in your annual plan for 2026, you need to make sure that you are covering all bases. So it's not just about developing your programs, it's about having the right systems in place, it's about being grant ready, to have the right case for support, and looking at the big picture as well. So how do you align your programs to your budget and current capacity? So a starting point would be a simple exercise where you can list your top 3 projects and write down what would be the minimum deliverable version of those programs. So what is the full cost of that program? So if it was fully funded with all the resources you needed, and then what would be the minimum version of that program. So then decide what staff would be required on a minimum level and also at full capacity. And then you can start costing that and really decide whether to proceed with that program, scale it up or down, or pause. So, for example, you may have, I've given this as an example, monthly health mobile clinics visiting 5 villages. But when you have costed that programme at full capacity and you look at your current funding and the opportunities available, you may be really thinking, this is really stretching us at the moment. So what you would do is you would sit down and really thrash out, how much is this program going to cost if we scale it down? Maybe what does it look like if we only go into 2 villages or 1 village? What if we only do it every 2 months instead of every month? So once you've done that, you can then think, right, this is much more within the capacity of where we are now. And there is no reason why you can't scale it back up when funding allows. And of course, your budget should be based on your programs and developed after your work plan and not the other way round. So even if you're a small NGO, you should aim to develop simple project budgets for different projects that you run. So the expenditure should include the cost of all the staff, any stipends, transport, fuel, any equipment that is required. And then the overheads should also include your rent, your utilities like phones, mobiles, any IT, internet, and so on. And then any support costs of staff who work indirectly to support your NGO. So if you have administrators or finance people and they're not working directly on your projects, you can take what I would say between 10 and 12% and allocate that to your grants. So when you build your program budgets, make sure that you assess your organisational organisational capacity honestly. And that is really, really difficult. But this includes the number of staff and volunteers you have, their skills and experience. Assess the financial systems and processes, and also your M&E, your monitoring and evaluation and reporting. It's possible, of course, to overestimate your NGO's capacity, but it really is not unusual to have a gap in capacity. Every NGO I have worked in, and I've worked for several NGOs over the years, every single one of them was under-resourced. It's not uncommon. So really don't worry if you feel that your NGO is really under-resourced. Don't worry, it's really common. But the starting point is to really assess where you are now so that your fundraising can begin on a realistic basis and your pursuance of grants will be at the right level to give you the best chance of success. So, the clearer you are as a small NGO, the more realistic your fundraising strategy will be. So after taking these steps, you would be in a stronger position to match your programs and activities to the capacity of your organisation. So scaling some things down if necessary, and expanding others depending on the minimal budget and staff required to implement different programs. So what you may end up doing is thinking, let's scale this particular program down, but we can scale up certain activities that don't cost us quite so much money or don't cost us anything at all. So there may be things that you're doing that you feel actually they're not such a drain financially. Let's build those up, and the ones that are costing a lot, whilst we're still looking for funds, we scale them back. And of course, whatever you decide, that would then lead into your fundraising strategy for the year. So as a small or a recently formed NGO, it can be difficult to make decisions to scale back or pause programs, but ultimately you could just view this as a temporary pause, which can then be reinstated at a later date when you have the funding. So what I'm trying to do is to try and get you to really develop your NGOs at the pace and the capacity that you're at, because I think if you don't, what happens is you're always on a treadmill of trying to chase the money all the time and never quite getting where you want to be. So when developing the budget for different projects and activities, it's important to make sure that whatever the cost of the programme and activities, that this is aligned to the funding available. So this should be based on any confirmed funds that you have for 2026, then other funding that has a good chance of coming to you, or funds that have been committed but not yet received. And then other funding that you might secure but is uncertain. But in my experience, whilst you might include this in your fundraising strategy, I wouldn't include uncertain funding against your programs. So I wouldn't put any funding that you're not sure about into a program budget. Or if you're going to do it, you put it into a program budget, but you put the activities much later in the year to give you a chance of securing that funding. So really commit program expenses and activities against confirmed or committed funding only. And then, of course, if you have committed funding that perhaps you know will be received, but it will be received at different times of the year, try and align the activities to those different times of year when the funding is expected to come through, so that you phase your work according to the funding available. And that would be a low risk way of managing your NGO. So when assessing your capacity and programs, as the leader of your NGO, make sure that every program has a responsible person who takes accountability for making things happen, and that there is a clear work plan that is linked to the overall annual strategy and fundraising plan for 2026. So, for example, you might want to build in reporting requirements on outcomes for fundraising purposes. So, you need to make sure that you're very clear when you will receive reports on certain programs, and that can feed into the fundraising at the same time. Sorry. So, good practice when setting the strategy for the coming year is to make sure that the strategy, the budget, programs, staffing, and any other resources all align. And as we all know, things change as the year progresses. So it's good practice as the leader of an NGO to check everything each quarter, make adjustments, and reassign resources as required. So, don't be afraid to change your strategy halfway through the year. If things aren't going to plan, you're finding that the funding isn't coming in as you need to, you may need to adjust the activities that you're doing to keep everything aligned. So again, this is just a good rule of thumb to follow when developing your annual plan. So make sure that you're aligning your programs with a realistic budget based on your capacity, and that really gives you a low risk strategy for growth and success. So really think about that and start with your work plan, then form your budget based on your capacity, and then your fundraising strategy will follow. And of course, there are a number of classic mistakes that are very easy to fall into as a small or recently formed NGO. So these include, classic one is to run too many projects at once, and they take up time, resources, funding, and ignoring administration and overhead costs when you are forming program budgets. So remember, the more projects you run, the more it's going to impact on the backup that you need for your NGO operations. So if you stick to a smaller number of projects, you're not going to have so much in the way of demands on other staff or volunteers. The other mistake is to accept restricted funding, which doesn't include overhead costs. And what happens is then all the funding goes into a particular project, it overstretches your capacity, but you don't have any funding to support the actual running of your NGO. Another mistake is to expand activities without increasing staff and resources, so that you begin to expand your activities and scaling up, but you're actually stretching the resources within your NGO. So when you are developing your annual plan for 2026, make sure that you learn from some of these mistakes and that you take them into account when you start developing your strategy for this year. So just to sort of recap, the first thing and the first lesson and starting point is to really look at your programs. Start with your projects and really understand what is the minimum amount we need to run this program in terms of capacity. So look at where you are now, assess your capacity and think, do we have the capacity and the funding and the budget to actually run this program as it is? If not, you need to make a realistic decision as to whether you can scale it down temporarily. And so by doing that, you would need to assess what is the minimum requirements we need to run this program. And then don't be afraid to accept that your capacity is low, because it's not, don't think of it as being something that will always be like that. It's not a permanent situation. What you're doing is you're just assessing where you are now. So then be honest with your assessment of where you are in terms of your funding, your budget, your resources, and make decisions whether you need to pause some things, scale things up, scale things down. And remember, it's possible you may decide to make decisions to scale certain things down because they're costing you too much, but there are other things that you might be able to do that you can improve and increase and scale up that don't cost so much money. So from that, make sure that you have a fundraising plan that reflects your capacity and puts in place alternative funding streams, so you have a diverse funding mix. And part of that fundraising strategy would be to apply for grants that reflect the size and the capacity and the experience and the stage of your NGO's development. So the number of NGOs I have supported and worked for in the past where they're trying to apply for really big grants, and they genuinely don't have the capacity or the experience for them. So what I'm saying is try and pursue opportunities that really are within your capability. Be prepared to review your strategy and your fundraising plan regularly, and don't be afraid to realign it or readjust it throughout the year. So it's good practice every quarter to review where you are, and you may just want to make slight tweaks or slight adjustments to what you're doing to make sure that you are in control of what's happening, because that's what you really want to do. You want to be aiming to be in control, and the way you can be in control is to take small steps. So don't be overly ambitious. Small steps that lead you along a path towards that those objectives that you have formed for the year. And those objectives, remember, some of them will be program objectives, and they may be strategic, but some of those objectives might also be about your capacity. So they may be about strengthening certain areas of your operations, or strengthening certain areas of fundraising, or building certain funding streams. So when you set your objectives, keep them within a number that are achievable. So don't have 10 objectives for the year. Really focus and prioritize your objectives. So really decide, you may decide to have like one program or strategic objective and then 2 or 3 operational objectives. You know where you need to put your efforts in for this year. And then from that, communication is really, really important. So once you have got your plan in place, then whoever you're working with needs to understand what is the plan? What is the plan? What are the objectives that you're all working towards? And what is the fundraising target? So the fundraising target shouldn't be something that is only known by the fundraiser and the director or the CEO of your NGO. The fundraising plan should be a shared target so that everyone understands you all need to work together to try and raise as much money as possible. And it would help also, I found, to explain to staff uh, the cost of running different projects so that they begin to take ownership and they understand that money just doesn't fall into place. You have to work to achieve that fundraising target. And then from that, hold individual staff meetings with members of staff or volunteers to then develop individual work plans that reflect the bigger plan that you have put together. So each of those individual plans need to work towards, they're like mini work plans that feed into your overall strategy for 2026. So I hope that has given you a good basis to start your strategic planning for 2026. I think, you really need to be uh, optimistic about the year, be positive, and it doesn't matter how small you are. If you try and take small steps, you will find that you will move forward. So it's hard work running a small NGO. I totally understand how difficult it is for you, but I think you're all doing amazing jobs, and don't underestimate the impact that you have in your local communities. So I hope that gives you a really good starting point for the year. I have noticed in this last slide that I've made a spelling error in my email. So just to let you know, it is Consultancy Options, IONS, just in case you've taken note of that. But I'm very happy to take any questions that you've got now. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that insightful and practical presentation. Participants, we will now begin the Q&A session. Please send in your questions. The first question is, how much of budget should go to monitoring and evaluation?
I think that's a really good question. The way I would do it, if you're a really small NGO, I think you need to decide well, first of all, you need to think about your projects and think, well, how many projects do we have? And where are they geographically? So how much time will it take for us to visit those programs, check on the progress, do analysis of data, collect data and things like that? And does that require a full-time member of staff or a volunteer? So would you realistically need somebody working, whether it's in a voluntary capacity or a paid capacity, would you need them 5 days a week for 7.5 hours a day? What would they be doing in that time? So you need to really think about that and make a very sort of realistic assessment of what needs to be done and how long it would take to do those things. Now, what you might decide is that when you really think it through, if you're not running a major project, say, so I'm just talking small projects here. So it's very different if you are running a multi-year program funded by the EU, because their budget requirements and their funding and their M&E is really, really rigorous, and you would need to put a lot more effort into it. But if you're a small NGO and you've just got various community projects running, you might assess that and think to yourself, actually, we probably could spend 2 hours a day on this. It would take 2 hours to check in with all our projects, update things, and collect the information we need, and gather, personal stories and things like that. So over the course of the week, you're probably looking at about 10 hours a week. So then you start thinking, okay, well, if it's only 10 hours a week, that's what, 40 hours a month. So that's almost just one day a month. So in terms of your budget, you could then decide, okay, well, we will allocate the salary of a person for one day a month for M&E. If you think that your monitoring and evaluation requires more than that, and it requires 2 days a week, for example, then you would allocate 8 days a month to your M&E, and you would put in the salary costs for that person. If you don't have a person working on it, if you don't have a designated staff member, you might want to put a proportion of people's salaries on there. So that's the way I would go about deciding on how much to allocate for M&E. I think you need to look at your projects, decide where they are geographically, what information you're trying to gather, what is the change that you're seeking, and the indicators, and then assess how much time is this going to take. And then from that, then you put an expenditure cost against that. So I hope that gives you an idea. I wouldn't just allocate a certain percentage of overheads to M&E. I wouldn't do it that way. I would go about it in a more realistic way, really, especially if you're a small NGO.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your input. The next question is, how can a small NGO fund its fixed strategy where opportunities are limited?
Anu, would you mind just saying that again?
I think might be the typing mistake from the user. It's like, how can a small NGO get fund if it's a fixed strategy when opportunities are limited?
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure if I kind of understand the
All right,
question.
so we can skip as we have many questions. I can take the other one.
Okay.
Yeah. What are the steps that can be taken to make a local NGO visible to both local and foreign donors?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think, one of the things that you could do as a small NGO is, if you don't have a, I mean, all small NGOs, if you're registered, you will have a management committee. Now, it depends on who you've got on your management committee, but if you've already got a management committee and they've got contacts, then one of the key ways would be to work with your management committee to really get them to open doors for you. If you're a health NGO, if you don't have a management committee with networks or contacts, then what you can do is you can form an advisory board. So you research key people who would be useful to your NGO. So if you are a health NGO, You might invite some health professionals. They could be consultants at local hospital. They could be lecturers in health. They might be local government officials, and you make a direct approach to those people, and you say, "We are forming an advisory board. We would be really delighted if you were able to accept our invitation to be part of this," and give them a time commitment so they understand it's not a huge amount of time. It might only be, I don't know, once one meeting a quarter. It is whatever you decide. But the point is to try and form a, a board of people who can help you get into that community. So local leaders, or chiefs, wherever you are, business people, eminent people working in whichever field you operate in as your NGO. And then you have a meeting with them and you talk to them about the NGO and you say, what can we do as a group to highlight the work that we do? Where can we go? And you would be surprised at how many people will know somebody who knows somebody who can give you a meeting or open a door into an opportunity. People quite often will, if they are asked, quite often they can be flattered to be asked. So, if you position the advisory board as a prestigious kind of board of people, then quite often people will be flattered and they would be happy to give their expertise in some way as a way of giving back. So that's the way I would start. If you want to really kind of expand into your community, look at your management committee and what networks they have. If you feel that they don't have the right networks, then work with them to identify who would be good and create an advisory committee. And then, of course, you've got all the usual community meetings, church meetings, and things like that. So another way to do it is, I've worked in organisations where what we've done is we've formed small branches, if you like, of the NGO or the charity. So you just get small groups of people. They might start with a PTA association at school, something like that. And they just start in small ways and then they just do little bits of fundraising. And what I mean by that is it could be very simple. It could be a coffee morning, it could be a cake sale, it could be a small event. Nothing big. And they promote your NGO and the work that you do, and they raise small amounts of money, and that filters in to your overall fundraising. So I hope that's given you a few ideas as to how you might do that.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your input. Dear participants, due to time constraints, we won't be able to address all the questions submitted to it today. However, we truly appreciate your engagement and thoughtful questions. As we have come to the end of this webinar, I would like to sincerely thank each one of you for your active participation. On behalf of entire Funds for NGOs team, we would also like to extend a special thank to Cheryl for sharing her expertise and insights. Participants, we kindly request you to take a moment to fill out the feedback form for today's session. Your feedback is extremely important to us to help us improve future webinars. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to contact us at support@fundsforngos.org. The feedback form will appear on your screen shortly. Once again, thank you, Cheryl, and to all our participants. We look forward to seeing you in our next Funds for NGOs webinar. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye for
Thank
now.
you. Bye.